Our second speaker tonight has come all the way up from Melbourne for this event, and for that we are deeply grateful. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Craig Baudin, the Director of Architecture at Fender Katsalidis Architects. Ray's an experienced architect. He's done a great deal of work in Australia, Hong Kong and Malaysia, and we welcome him this evening to share Fender Katsalidis' design for the Greenland Centre.
Thank you. Okay, this is the project was as I think everyone found, it's quite a challenging one to take a 200-metre tower and drop it into a 60s era 30-storey office building and then refurbish the whole lot for apartments, and then at the end of it still end up with a tower that's a landmark in Sydney and something that contributes to the skyline of Sydney is quite a challenge. So a lot of architectural and structural challenges. The following slides are pretty much a cut-down version of what we show Greenland. There might be a lot of really rapid clicking. I think I might run out of time, but I'll try to go through it as logically as I can. I'll just go straight into the sort of the key image, I suppose, is Bathurst and Pitt Street. What we ended up with, which I think most of the competitors end up with, is a sort of tripartite or at least two-part scheme where you have this existing 30-storey structure and then a new tower scheme on top of it, and it's the choice of whether you try to reflect that new tower on top of it as something different, or have it read as something as a holistic whole that goes the whole way up. We went sort of down the path of trying to treat them as, in a way, as three separate elements: a podium, an existing refurbishment of the old building as a middle section, and then this new elegant sort of tower form going up above it. Or if I turn something off, okay, sorry. So from the start, we had this idea of that the site really sits on this sort of central axis in the city, and it's almost the centre line of the CBD. In a way, we've got, and it's obviously a very key location to Sydney, key Sydney landmarks. And so the idea of this central axis was really interesting. We really thought it was important that the ground plane should be permeable and open to pedestrians. So we came up with this idea of a central gateway and a central access through the site. And also Nonda in our office had this idea of, it was really taken with this sculpture by Arnaldo Pomodoro, which were these massive bronze gates from the Shanghai Expo. And the idea of getting an artist commission as public art is something we've always tried to work into a lot of our projects. And so he had this concept of almost a podium, super-scaled art installation that could become a gateway in a figure, like in a metaphorical sense, to the site. And this was some of the rendering work we did around, at a conceptual level, if there was this super-scaled entry gateway that was an artist commission that was on that key axial point through to the site, and that leads directly to the hotel on the southern edge of the site. And that sort of started to drive a lot of our thinking about how the ground plane worked. And it also kind of tied into our idea of splitting the cores and the structure for the building. We had an idea of a split core. And then getting this sort of central axial space that would be a large volume space down the middle, like so. And then that worked quite well in terms of separating a sort of a premium and a low-rise apartment entry lobby. And then also having a separate sort of entry point for this community hub space, which was part of the brief off Bathurst Street. And then that then provided a natural link to the hotel and gave us that sort of permeability on the site that we felt was really important, bringing the cars in a porte cochere off Bathurst Street and out to Pitt Street. And then the car parking for the site coming in off the hotel, the southern edge of the hotel site, which is off the screen to the south. And so this was some of the ideas that we had about, well, if you had this double volume space, you've got the hotel off to the left, you've got Bathurst Street to the right, and just creating this large volume that is permeable, that people can walk through. You have vehicular traffic as well, but giving priority to pedestrians. And then idea of a water wall on both sides, taking its cues from natural forms, which is something Nonda is particularly interested in, and it's something we've explored in our Mona Museum project, but also taking these sort of tessellated forms out of nature as part of creating this double volume space at the ground plane. And then above that we had this a requirement for this community hub space, and we thought, well, if you're going to do a community hub, you really need to do it properly. It's no point in just allocating 2,000 square meters of random office space. How does it actually get used so it is actually a community asset? And so we felt it needed decent sized auditoriums, performance spaces and studios, and this became the sort of the wrapping element of the car park on Bathurst Street. So the lower portion of the old 60s building is effectively car park in most interpretations of the brief, I think. And the idea of wrapping this community hub space around this car park. And then we, as a sort of a motif on this facade, we took this idea of a supersized hexagonal supergrid in bronze cladding. And that was also, again, taking cues from sort of natural forms using hexagons as a motif for the ground, for that podium element. And then the heritage building itself was a bit of a takeoff point as well. The idea of, we have this Art Deco building which has a lot of intricate bronze detailing. It is quite horizontal in nature, that sort of streamlined Art Deco forms. And that started to inform some of our approaches to the tower element, where we took these more horizontal fenestration emphasis with these curvilinear edges. And then some of that bronze detailing and the detailing of the palette and the materiality of the tower and the podium. So as a whole composition, we ended up with this sort of tripartite arrangement, which in theory, okay, so we got a bit of a Mac PC translation issue. I knew one of them wouldn't go right. And so the idea of the tower being this thing that stands above the existing 30-story building, and then we've got a transfer deck with residence facilities between the two as a transition. So you end up with these three distinct forms, and treating this low-rise apartment, low-rise rise of apartments within the existing structure, but redoing the facade, but then basically being true to what it is. It's a rectilinear 60s era building. And with any project, orientation and ESD is important. One of the things that we found really interesting working this job was our first introduction to CEP 65, and it was mentioned earlier. I think Melbourne has a lot to learn from CEP 65, I think, and I think it's probably currently going to adopt something very similar, I'd imagine. The idea behind our approach with the floor plate, especially for the tower, was looking at rounded edges to reduce to improve the lateral stability of the building under wind. Also, a response to that idea of the heritage building and those curvilinear forms, and then scooping out a section of the north of the facade to create more corners to the building. So we get more buildings with more apartments with cross ventilation, and in this part we had this two-part core with a large void for planting in the middle, which basically formed a series of three-story sky gardens the whole way up the building, and then bridging the apartments' balconies across that, which probably makes a bit more sense in this slide here. So the idea that these are the apartment balconies with screening, and in Sydney's climate, this is not something you'd want to attempt in Melbourne, but three-story triple volume gardens all the way up, which are effectively open to the common areas and the lobbies, so you have naturally ventilated lobbies. And that's how that reading works from the external part of the facade. You get this sort of fissure that goes the whole way up the structure. And then this transfer structure is effectively where we have the communal facilities for pool and gym and so on, which I'll get to in subsequent slides. I might skip past these, we're probably going to be running out of time. Structural, we worked closely with Robert Berg Group to look at some approaches as to how we get the lateral stability in the building, and also in terms of sequencing, how do we do it fast? How do you get the requisite stability of the tower? There's a lot of talk in the brief about exoskeletons, and we weren't really convinced by the idea of an exoskeleton. We've got a building that has a slenderness ratio of 10:1 effectively. So the idea was dropping a twin core right down the center of this existing building. And how do you do that in a way that still allows this existing building to be fitted out and not disrupted for weeks and months and years on end? So what was interesting about this building is it's got vertical main beams running this way and then concrete planks running east-west. And we thought, well, if we just removed all the planks in red and toned in pink in this diagram, and then we put 2 jump form cores right down the middle of it and just jump right the way up through the middle, we could get something done quite quickly and leave the existing building could be fitted out whilst those jump forms are running up. And this is something we've done in Melbourne, almost the exact same dimensions, interesting enough, as a project we've just been completed. You've got 6.6 metres and 150 mil clearance and just basically slid up between these 2 buildings. And we did some work around how the raft slab would be post-fitted without disruption to existing columns. And so in a 3-dimensional sense, you have the tower, the existing building, you pull out all the planks, you start jumping from the bottom, and at the same time you start to create a transfer structure on top of the old building that goes which is loaded off the existing structure. And the theory is that by the time the loading on the top structure gets sufficiently onerous on the existing building, the jump form has reached it from below. And so you get this kind of dual sequencing approach that you can accelerate the program. These are just some massing diagrams, which I'll go very quickly, basement, so on, just explaining how the building stacks, but I might just skip up through the podium. This is all hub and parking. But in terms of when you get to the tower plates, so we have these rectilinear plates in the old building, the existing 60s building. And again, a similar approach about looking at scooping out a portion of the north to get cross ventilation in. Then we had a plant room, and then the transfer structure, and then our community facilities, pool, gym, for the residents, barbecues and so on. And this is just a bit of a slide showing how that would read underneath that large transfer structure which supports the building above.
I'm start chasing you, Steve, Craig.
Okay, and then apartments above that, which are all, as the floor plate we described before, so fairly curvilinear, large number of, trying to maximize the number of corners in the building. And then penthouses at the very top. That's the problem with animations, you can't skip them quickly. And so that sort of culminated in a mega penthouse, 2 per floor for the top 2 levels. And then a roof crown element, which was concealing plant, etc. And then the idea of a penthouse level common facility, secret garden, lap pool. And that's it. 490 apartments. Those are all the metrics and so on. That's it.